Okay. So for this talk, this is going to be this talk is going to be with Harini and Gupta. So both of them work at IBM, and Harini is a senior technical staff member at IBM. So,
hi, good afternoon.
Oh.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me? Yeah, my name is Srinivasan, and you can call him Guru. We're going to present this work that we've been doing for the last year or so, and it's on using foundation models to predict above ground biomass, and the goal is nature-based carbon sequestration. So let me just quickly go over the agenda here. So we're going to split this up. So I'll talk about the problem statement and the IBM geospatial foundation model approach. It's only 30 minutes is our talking time, so we're not going to be able to go into a lot of the details. There are some publications coming out, so we can always point you to papers. And then Guru will talk about the rest of the data sets, the challenges that we face. That's not a trivial problem. The various experiments, how we measure performance, and some results too. Okay. So some numbers here. 50 billion is the number of tons of carbon dioxide that is being emitted, I think, released per year into the atmosphere. So if you do back of the envelope calculation, that will require us to plant 1 trillion trees to counter this. 148 billion is the cost of climate-related disasters just in 2021. And like many of us, 75% of consumers today are very climate aware when they make purchases. And the main thing here is also the 68 trillion. So that's the amount of money that climate-conscious investors are funding. So sustainability is a big problem, and we actually are coming from the IBM Sustainability Software Division, and we work on a series of problems. And this particular team, we are working on many natural, nature-related solutions. We do outage prediction. The weather is a key component. We gave a talk last year, and earlier we spoke about a couple of my colleagues here spoke about. Using LiDAR and satellite imagery to find proximity of vegetation to power line, because that's a fire hazard. And this talk is about nature-based carbon sequestration. As we all know, the most efficient way of converting carbon dioxide into carbon, is biomass or whatever, is nature. So you plant more trees, you can absorb more carbon dioxide. You also have the carbon dioxide absorbed on the, in water, that is by phytoplanktons, mangrove, that's called blue carbon. Today's talk is more on the soil carbon, so whatever is being absorbed by trees. So that's the high level. Okay, so what is the problem statement here? We want to really predict how much carbon is in any area. Given let's use the geospatial term. There is a polygon, some area on the earth, we want to see how much carbon is there. That's our goal. And and we'll come to there are lots of manual ways of doing it, but our goal is to make this information reliable, scalable, so that we can take any polygon on the globe and be able to say how much carbon is there in that area. There are manual approaches. Okay, the real way of doing is to sample some trees, burn them down, say how much carbon is there. Okay, and that's not obviously the right thing to do. But there are also people there are lots and lots of vendors, companies out there, particularly in rainforest areas like the Amazonia, in Africa, where a lot of destruction has happened. And they actually go and measure the tree trunk. They measure the tree height, they know what the species is, they take samples by hectare, and then they calculate what's called above ground biomass. There are allometric equations. The forestry people, if anybody is here, you better than me, you will know that there are these allometric equations that take these basic quantities and it can compute what the biomass is. The biomass is not necessarily in the leaves, it's mostly in the trunk, in the branches, and there's also biomass under the ground. All the roots are all carbon, right? So there's a general formula. Some percentage of the above ground is the below ground biomass. And then that's the mass, and from that you can convert it to carbon, because like 0.45 or 0.5% of the biomass, above ground biomass, is the actual carbon. So then when they do these samples, then they take those samples and extrapolate them to other trees in the field. Okay, so that's how they calculate the biomass. Now, so to go further, so as you can see, they do this manual local assessment. It's labor intensive. It also can be error prone, but the ground truth is great. Most of the time we have good ground truth, but it doesn't scale. So there are various machine learning techniques out there to actually take satellite imagery data and use some ground truth data like height, and you calculate the biomass in specific areas, and then you can label data, and then you can compute the biomass. You can build models to compute biomass. And so satellite imagery, why is it useful? Because it will give you, and Guru will go into the details of the specific kind of satellite imagery that we use, but it can give you not just the RGB, it can give you all these infrared bands, and it will be able, you can actually detect vegetation, you can detect, and that based on the penetration of the various imagery, you can actually see how much volume of, leaf, which kind of translates to the biomass. So, so what is our approach? We want to build, like, as we call wall-to-wall estimates of above ground biomass density in an area. And what we do is we use multispectral satellite imagery. We are continuing to improve on the input images. So it's not just satellite imagery of one flavor, multispectral, but we're also looking at radar imagery here. But what we are also using is as labels is the industry established above ground biomass density labels. And Guru will go into the details of that as well. So what we are doing then is that we are building, while we can build a model per region, using that region satellite imagery and whatever labels we have, we want to be able to scale this. So this is where the foundation model approach comes. Okay, so very quickly, I think everybody knows. This is the, the pitch for traditional models. You have labeled data, you have, AI models for each task. Foundation models is where you have different kinds of input data, and we know everybody understands this very well. I mean, almost to a good extent for text, images, videos, etc. You build a pre-trained model that is self-supervised model, and then using that you can build a whole bunch of downstream tasks. So in the tradition, I wouldn't say traditional, but in the circuit, for the type of inputs that everybody is familiar with, like languages, images, videos, we do, Q&A, translation, sentiment analysis, code generation, for example. They're all a bunch of downstream tasks that can be implemented as fine-tuned models. Now, and I don't want to go into the details of this because this is well known, people have published this. What we are specifically working on is using the input satellite imagery, and we call them geospatial foundation models. This is a big effort in IBM research, and we are only partially involved in the pre-trained geospatial foundation model learning work itself. That is primarily done only by IBM research at this point, where they're taking these large amounts of this multispectral satellite imagery and building pre-trained models, which is like essentially learning the relationships between the bands temporally, spatially, etc. And this is like huge volume of data. Right now we have actually built models for across the globe. Using this pre-trained model, we can then have we actually have a bunch of downstream tasks for segmentation or for classification. Our specific problem is to find above ground biomass. So it's a regression problem. So what we want to do is estimate, what is the forest biomass using the pre-trained model as input, and we have, the fine-tuned models in between. Okay, does that make sense? So so when we build these foundation models, they are built globally, and then for a specific fine-tuned task, we get the corresponding label data. So the pre-trained model is the foundation model global. Then for a specific task, in our case above ground biomass, we get the labels for that task, and then we tune the pre-trained model using this label. But there's a lot of work that goes in between, and Guru will go into the details. We have to process the input data. We have to harmonize the data with with the label data, do the modeling, and then train, tune, test, whatever, and then deploy them, and we have an inference engine that can score the model. And then we can do some process afterwards that will take the biomass density, calculate the carbon, and build some statistics on top. So that's the approach that we are using. And before I hand over to Guru, who will talk about the data sets, the challenges, experiments we've done. Any questions so far on the problem statement or the general approach? All right, let me hand over to Guru. You can feel free to stop us anytime and ask questions.
Okay, so I'll just talk a little bit about the data sets for our biomass estimation. So the most important data set that we have is called the HLS, or it's called the Harmonized Landsat Sentinel-2. So basically it's a kind of a satellite imagery which is at 30-meter resolution. So each pixel in the image is 30 meters. This Harmonized Landsat imagery, it's available all over the globe, and it comes in forms of tiles, and each tile is 3660 by 3660 pixels. That's roughly equivalent to 110 by 110 kilometers. And it's available all across the globe and also every few days. So that's a very useful component of this satellite imagery, that you can use this to chart even the changes in different features on the Earth. So, and it's freely available from NASA. So it's one of the very useful data sets that we have from NASA. So I'll just like to show you a sample of this image, so it will be more clear and intuitive what I'm talking about. So we have this geospatial tool which we use called QGIS. So here I'm showing an image from this Harmonized Landsat Sentinel-2. So you can see this is in form of a tile, and behind the image I have a Google satellite view of the same area on Earth. So you can see that when I click on any particular point on this image, I have these 10 band values here. So basically every HLS image, it has different wavelengths for each pixel. So it can be red, blue, green, and there are some other wavelengths like near infrared, shortwave infrared, and wavelengths which the visible eye cannot see. I'll go into that in a minute. But you can see that it has values for all these 10 bands, and this gives us a lot of information, hidden information, which can be useful to predict a lot of stuff, and biomass being one of them. So let me go back to the. So as I said that this imagery has wavelengths from red, blue, green, up to a certain wavelength it goes into the shortwave infrared. So you can see the visible spectrum, and but you can also see ranges outside of the visible spectrum. And this satellite is equipped with special sensors which are able to measure this wavelength. And sometimes this imagery is also called hyperspectral imagery. So now, as I mentioned, we have all these different bands. As I showed, 10 bands on the software. For our purpose, usually we only use 6 of these bands. So blue, green, red, and near infrared, which is close to the infrared. And then we have something called as shortwave infrared 1 and 2. The difference only is that the wavelengths for these wavelengths are slightly different. So, and these are available all from NASA. So this was all about the satellite imagery that we use as the training data. Now let's talk about LiDAR data. So LiDAR is actually a data set which is also remote sensing, but it's basically laser pulses which are being transmitted from a sensor down to the Earth. And it is very useful to measure distances between objects relative to other objects relative to Earth. And it basically creates like a 3-dimensional map of any particular place on the Earth. So it's a very high resolution data set, and main thing is that it's very expensive to procure. So it's not available as easily as the satellite imagery. And usually there are some sources where you can get it for free. There are some publicly available LiDAR, and sometimes you have to buy this kind of data, basically. So we have something called as JDI from NASA, which is basically a global ecosystems dynamic investigation. It's an initiative by NASA, which basically uses LiDAR. So they have this sensor placed on the International Space Station, and they send the laser pulses to the Earth, and they cover the whole globe using those laser pulses every few days. And so they have like a map of the whole world, and it's a very useful data set that NASA started. The only thing is that it's not very dense, it's a little bit sparse, and there are some challenges with the accuracy of this data as well, which I will get into in a minute. But this data set has few different products. The two main offerings from this data from NASA, one is the height information. So basically you can tell what is the height of the canopy or height of the tree on any point on Earth. And the second one is the above ground biomass density, what we refer to as AGBD. So basically that is how much biomass is present in one particular area on Earth. And usually they derive this biomass also from the height. So these NASA guys, they have some kind of models to extrapolate the height to the biomass. They work with forestry experts, university researchers, and they have people go into the field and they have something called as allometric equations, which are just equations which relate the height to the biomass. So they use those equations and they come up with this biomass number. And this is a very useful data for researchers, because we can use this as a training data label, and we can interpolate this data to regions in the world where we do not have this biomass. So as I mentioned, this is placed on the ISS, and this is what the sensor looks like on the ISS. And basically, this is how the points, the LiDAR points, look on the surface of the Earth. So basically, it's in form of straight lines, and in each line, every point is separated by around 60 meters, and every point is a 25-meter footprint. So that means that when the laser hits one particular point, the area that it covers is around 25 meters in any one direction. And then the separation between two lines is around 600 meters. And so using that LiDAR, they estimate the height of all these points. And using these heights, they extrapolate it to get the biomass. Okay, so now I'll talk about the challenges that we face with these data sets. So the first challenges that we have is with the HLS data that I talked about earlier. So and it's also an artifact for usually any satellite imagery. So because it's a satellite imagery, and we know that everywhere on Earth there are clouds. At any point, whatever image you take, there will be clouds in that. But clouds poses a lot of challenge for doing machine learning, data science, or any kind of data related work. So we don't want to have clouds. So we have a way of dealing with that. So basically it's like we take different images from different timestamps for the same area on Earth, and we have a method to combine them into one composite image. So you can see that there are these white pixels are clouds in this image. Every image has clouds. But when we combine them, there are almost no clouds in the final image. So this is a very important step because it gives us a lot of data which otherwise we would have discarded, right? So, and also one important point is that for the purpose of biomass, since we only want to look at areas or times when there is actual leaves on the trees, right? So we only take these images which fall inside the time range when there are leaves on the trees. So this time range will vary for different regions on the Earth, depending on the growing season and all of that. And also, this biomass requires this cloud-free imagery for a continuous prediction, right? So if you want to predict a biomass for any area on Earth for, let's say, 2 years, 3 years, or X number of years, so it has to have a continuous input of that imagery from those months, whatever the date range for that area might be. Yes?
Why do you only want to look at it when there's leaves on the trees?
So as I said, if there are no leaves on the trees, it won't give us an accurate representation of the biomass, because leaves also have biomass in them, and actually that is the main data that we are using to estimate the biomass, because there are different, the leaves will have different colors, and as I said, it's not just red, blue, green, but there are other wavelengths that we can't see, right? So if there are no leaves, there will be basically inaccurate data, and it won't represent actual biomass that the tree can store, basically. Did I answer your question?
But it doesn't store that biomass year round. It's only when the leaves are on the trees that it's captured.
So the biomass actually changes over the year, right? So during the growing season, if they have leaves, they will store more biomass, and when the leaves go off, the tree will still store biomass, but it will be less because there are no leaves, right?
Yeah.
So the biomass will change over the year, and technically we can measure measure biomass even when there are no leaves. But most of the problems we are interested in are during the growing season, and also we want to estimate the capacity of that area to measure to store the carbon or store the biomass. So that's only possible when you look at the leaves included.
The other thing is that some of these, as you were saying, the infrared bands will help us get a vegetation index. So vegetation, there's vegetation, which means there is a tree. There could be something else like grass or shrubs, but that's where the label data will help us. So because the above ground biomass will be higher when you have like a bigger tree, so the reflectance from the leaves, is basically coming from these bands that are in the satellite image.
Thank you.
And one more thing, the trees don't grow that fast. So even if you look at month over month change, the growth is not that much. It's more if we ever want to see month over month change, it's more like sudden destruction, fire has happened, and that will also count.
Yeah, so in that case, if we see that there are no leaves on the trees and suddenly, or there are no trees, right? It will look like a deserted sort of thing or a deforested thing. We can actually input that to the model, and it will give us a prediction of the biomass, and then you can say that, oh, the biomass has decreased so much. So it's a way of actually measuring deforestation as well. Any other questions?
I wanted to ask about how climate change has affected the default season a lot too. So does that impact the imagery in any way? Or?
Yes, so actually that's a good question, and the whole reason we are doing this is ultimately to measure the effects of climate change itself, right? So as I mentioned, if we measure for, let's say, 1 month, we have an area where we have some biomass, right? And after 1 month or 2 months, we measure the same area, and our prediction is very less, right? So that will give us an indication that there is something happened, right? Probably deforestation, or there can be some kind of climate event that wiped out the trees. We'll analyze more into that, what happened, but it will be a starting point for us to measure the effects of climate change. So yes, that's ultimately the aim of this thing. Okay. Oh, sorry.
So you said that your training data are from LiDAR, so because that can figure out the height, but you could have a tree with a pretty small trunk and a big canopy, or a very thick trunk and the same size canopy. So
Yes.
How are you getting good estimation?
Yes, that's actually a very good point. That is one of the, you can say, challenges of our approach. Because, as I said, we use the satellite imagery. Main reason is that because it's free, right? And it's very scalable. It's all available all over the world. But as you said, you cannot really infer the height from the satellite imagery. It only has all these different wavelengths. So our assumption is that these wavelengths are somehow correlated with the biomass. One other factor which obviously the biomass will be affected by, as you said, is how tall the tree is and how big is the canopy, what is the area, all of that stuff. since we don't have the height information for everywhere in the world, we only can now rely on just the satellite imagery. So that is one of the, you can say, points that we can include in the future. But that's a challenge. Yeah.
Yeah, and also the basic label data is built using different plant function types in different parts of the world. So at a high level, you know, like if you look at the tropical forest, they're going to be very different from what we have here, for example. So these trees are definitely taller here than if you go into the tropics. So those are kind of things that I'm not a forestry expert, but they have actually built this along with those experts. But yeah, and that's why we're also looking into bringing other sources of imagery.
I just wanted to know, so when you look at the imagery from leaf on season, does the carbon sequestration change during leaf off? And do like forest fires perhaps like affect the this?
Yeah, they do. So as I said earlier, like usually during leaf on season, we will have more carbon, and for the same year, let's say. And after a few months, if it's a leaf off season, the carbon will be a little bit less. And also if there has been some kind of desertification or deforestation, that will also result in reduction of carbon in that.
Okay, I have a follow-up question. Which areas do you focus on predominantly?
So this approach is built for anywhere in the world. So this can be applied to estimate the carbon anywhere in the world. It depends on the client or whoever is applying this, where he or she or user wants to focus on, and for what purpose they want to focus on. That's a separate story. But basically, this approach is only to estimate the carbon anywhere in the world for any time range that you want, using this particular imagery. Yeah, sorry. Okay, so let's talk about the challenges with the JDI, which is the LiDAR data. So basically, as I said, because the LiDAR sensor is placed on the ISS, it can lead to geolocation errors because it's very far away from Earth. And also there are some quality filters that we apply on the raw JDI data, which is recommended by NASA. So I'll just mention briefly, some of them are related to time of the day. So the sensor is going on like all the time. So there are some observations it takes during the day and some during the night. And NASA recommends you should take only the night observations, because during the day, it's like it can get noisy data because of the sun, basically. And then there are some aspects related to the sensitivity. So basically, everywhere on Earth, different areas have different density of vegetation. So very dense vegetation will require more high power of the laser to penetrate it. So different areas will have a different sensitivity measurement, which the NASA recommends that you should take into consideration as well. And as I already mentioned, leaf off, we don't want to take observations which are in the leaf off season, so we discard all of those observations. So, yeah.
Including leaf off data, couldn't you add to the biomass prediction by saying, okay, you have leaf on, you have leaf off, estimate the reduction in biomass?
Good idea, yeah.
Yes, yeah, I think that's an interesting point, and there can be something done in that aspect. So yeah, that's a good point. So now let's talk about how we process the data. So basically, we get the HLS data, which is the satellite imagery. Then we, as I mentioned, we do the processing to remove the clouds, so that's the cloud free. And then we download the JDI LiDAR data, which is our labels. Then basically we harmonize the labels with the HLS imagery. Harmonize basically means that for each pixel inside the satellite imagery, we associate the JDI latitude, longitude. So every pixel will have a label basically. And then we create the training, test, and validation set. So this is just the same thing in picture format. So as you can see, you can combine different timestamps into one image, as I talked about earlier. And then you apply the filters on the NASA data, you get the harmonized data. And so we have, I mentioned here something called as a pulsar. So in addition to HLS, satellite imagery, we sometimes also use additional data sets. So one of them is the pulsar. Pulsar is basically, it's a radar-based data set. So like HLS is a data set which uses electromagnetic waves. Similarly, pulsar is also an electromagnetic wave, but it's a very different wavelength. So it's useful because it's able to penetrate into the trees, and it gives us additional information about the structure of the earth, basically. So it's an additional data set that we also use. And then we combine all of those data sets together, we split them, and then we input that to our foundation model, and the foundation model gives out a prediction on any data that we input. Any questions on this? Okay. Okay, so I'll just talk about different kinds of experiments that we do with our foundation models. So broadly, basically, there are three different kinds of experiments or parameters that we tune. The first one is your vanilla hyperparameters. So as in any deep learning approach, you have like batch size and learning rate, optimizer, scheduler, size of the layers, number of layers, all of these common deep learning parameters. So that's one of the parameters that we tune. The other one is usually for foundation models, we have something called as a decoder head or a decoder part. So there is an encoder part and there is a decoder part. So we experiment with different kinds of architecture in the decoder head. I won't go into too much detail, but basically there are a lot of different architectures available in the research community, in the deep learning community, and we experiment with all of them to get the best possible model, basically. And then, of course, we also experiment with different features or bands. As I mentioned, we have the HLS bands. We also have the pulsar, the radar signal. We have some other bands, imagery, elevations, stuff like that, which we can also input to the model. Any questions on it? Okay. So, and all of this experiments, all of this coding is done in the PyTorch framework. Okay, so let's talk about how we measure the performance of these models, right? So one major challenge with this problem is it's a regression problem, first of all, right? And the range of values that this biomass can take can be very large. So it can be for any area 0 to 5,000 even, right? So it's very challenging to measure, as you know, in regression. There are various metrics like root mean square error, RMSE, and then RMSE percent or R square, and all of these metrics. We mostly focus on RMSE or RMSE percentage, and then we also have Pearson and Spearman correlation, right? But how we look at these metrics is we have a number for the whole range, right? Let's say we have a test data. The actual values in the test data range from 0 to 5,000, and our predictions are whatever 0 to 5,000 as well. And we look at the RMSE of this whole range. Then we also break down this RMSE into different bins. So we have, let's say, 0 to 50 biomass, then 50 to 100, 100 to 200, and so on, right? Because different areas in the world have different distribution of biomass as well. So the user might be interested in some particular bins which are more important to get right. So we break down this RMSEs and all these metrics into different bins, and we measure all these bins as well. And apart from just the numerical metrics part, we also look at how the image looks, how our prediction looks on in the image, because it has to make sense, right? That is it's a kind of a subjective approach, but it's very important as well, because for whoever the user is, we look at what is the distribution of the biomass. If something doesn't feel right, even if your RMSE numbers and everything is very good, we can't say that the model predicted very well, because spatial distribution looks off, basically, right? So we have to look at all of these aspects of the model, and for each model we look at these different results and then get basically which is the best one. So how we also compare our results of the foundation model is we have some baseline models. So for example, UNet, right? So UNet is just a very common deep learning, CNN-based deep learning framework, which can be used for classification and regression. So we train a normal UNet, and we measure our performance against this model. And some challenges that we have are basically, as I said, the biomass can range, has a very wide range. So, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, question. So, if I understand correctly, your model is doing very well in the center of the distribution, but in the tails you are over or under predicting?
Yes.
Is that the case? Is that because of the density in those specific areas?
So it is definitely partly because of the distribution. Most of the time we have much more data in the center, and since that is what the model uses as input, it will do very well on the central part. And as you said, like usually in the high AGB range we have very less data, and so the model doesn't have a lot of data to predict on in that range. But sometimes it's also the way these bands interact with each other. Sometimes biomass in the low range and biomass in the high range can have very similar features. So the model is not able to distinguish very well.
Do they tend to be in the same area, geographical region, the low density and the high density in the same?
Yes,
It can, like
yeah,
particularly if you look at the Amazon, right?
Yes.
That because of deforestation, you can, if you put a whole bunch of these tiles and train the model, you can see like dense forest, you can see like wiped out areas too.
It depends like how granular you want to go. If you take a big enough area, you can get all kinds of distributions in the area.
So it is in the bands area where you're having this discrepancy. The measurement right there is not accurate. Oh no, the measure is accurate, but there is something going on with deforestation and very dense vegetation.
Yeah, but in general, in this this kind of research, all the models, they tend to over predict on the low AGB end and under predict on the high AGB end. That's like an ongoing challenge. So we are also trying to solve that using additional data sets and keep improving our architecture basically. So as already mentioned, we don't predict very well on the high AGB, or we under predict basically. And also, as I said earlier, that we have very few data sets for like third-party verification. So we will come up with our own estimates, right? But how do we know they are right? We have the labels which we measure against. But if we want to predict for an area for which we don't have labels, how do we know that how good our model is? So sometimes we have some third-party models as well, which we can use as reference. But there are also challenges with those models that they can be in different resolution than us. So it's not a apples to apples comparison, but it's kind of like a wishy-washy way of looking at the results. Okay, so let's look at some results now. So basically here we have like a prediction from our model on the whole globe. So the top image is the biomass, and you can see the scale of the biomass here. And the bottom you have the uncertainty of the same biomass, right? So and you can see the scale there. So that's one of the big aspects of our model, of our foundation model, is that it's scalable. So you can have this result for the whole globe, right? And then we can also go down, zoom in into some area. So for example, here on the left side, we have the prediction from this geospatial foundation model. And for reference, we have biomass prediction from another source. This is basically a data set from something called as a climate change initiative. It comes from the European Space Agency, right? So the space people from Europe, right? But the challenge here is that this one is at 100-meter resolution. So as I just mentioned, this is a different resolution, right? But you can see that like overall they tend to match, right? Like where we have high biomass and low biomass. But if you zoom in too much, right, you will see the differences. Like here we are predicting a bit higher biomass. These guys are not doing that, right? And So there are regional differences. Like here, they predict a bit higher, but we predict a bit lower, right? So that's the challenge that I was mentioning. It's very challenging to see how our predictions are doing, right?
Yeah, but here we also have the advantage of having higher resolution data.
Right. Right. And also other differences are this one is from 2020 and our prediction is from 2023. So something can change in those 3 years as well. Okay, so just another results. Basically, it's like we have the prediction on the same area from a very basic random forest. Then we have a prediction from the unit, right? And then we have a prediction from the foundation model. So again, you can see that there are subtle differences in the prediction, right? And we have measured our performance, and the foundation model does the best, basically, right? We measure it relative to whatever labels we have in this image. Just talking a little bit about the packages, Python packages that we use. So as I mentioned earlier, most of the coding is done in PyTorch. We use geospatial packages because we work with geospatial data. So we have raster.io, we have GeoXarray to work with TIFF data, which is the raster data. And then we have GeoPandas to work with the vector data. And then we have GTAL, PTAL to manipulate all these data, right? And then we have SciPy for all kind of scientific computing, and our scikit-learn for any kinds of machine learning techniques. Okay. I think that's the end of our presentation. So.